The steady beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound in the dimly lit hospital room. Outside, the muffled voices of nurses and the distant hum of a rolling cart echoed through the hall. Emma lay still, her pale face illuminated by the faint glow of the machines surrounding her. For months, she had been trapped in a deep, unyielding slumber, her body unresponsive despite the prayers and desperate pleas of her loved ones. Then, without warning, her fingers twitched. A small movement, barely noticeable, but enough to send a ripple through the silence. Her eyelids fluttered, her breath hitched, and with a sharp gasp, she jolted awake. The sudden motion caused a burst of panic in her chest, and her weak limbs trembled as she tried to move. Her throat burned like sandpaper, her muscles ached, and confusion clouded her mind. Where was she? What had happened? Nurse Ellen, who had been adjusting the drip, nearly dropped the clipboard in her hands. Her heart pounded as she turned, eyes wide with disbelief. For months, Emma had shown no signs of waking, and now, just like that, she was back. The nurse rushed to her side, pressing the call button with trembling fingers. "Emma? Oh my God, sweetheart, you're awake," she breathed, her voice breaking with emotion. Emma's gaze darted around the unfamiliar room, panic creeping into her expression. Her breathing was ragged, her chest rising and falling too quickly. Flashes of memory slammed into her rain-soaked pavement, the cold grip of fear, the shadowed figure standing behind her. And then, falling. The sickening weightlessness, the sharp impact, and then, darkness. Her lips parted, dry and cracked, but she forced out a whisper, her voice hoarse from months of silence. It wasn't an accident. Her hands clenched into the sheets, her nails digging into the fabric as fear tightened around her like a noose. She swallowed hard and forced herself to speak again, though the words tasted like metal on her tongue. "He pushed me." Nurse Ellen froze. A cold shiver ran down her spine as the weight of those words sank in. The warmth of relief was instantly replaced by dread. Emma's accident, it wasn't an accident at all. Someone had wanted her gone. Someone had tried to kill her. Ellen reached for Emma's hand, squeezing it gently in reassurance, though her own fingers trembled. "Emma, honey, who did this to you?" she whispered, but Emma's breath quickened, her eyes darting to the shadows beyond the doorway, fear tightening her throat. She wasn't safe. Not yet. And if he knew she was awake, he would come back to finish what he started. Detective James Carter stared at the empty file cabinet, his jaw tightening. The case files, the ones containing crucial evidence about the Holloway disappearance, were gone. Not misplaced, not misfiled. Just gone. He ran a hand through his graying hair, frustration simmering beneath the surface. This wasn't just an accident. Someone had intentionally wiped the records clean. Across the dimly lit office, his partner, Detective Laura Bennett, paced near the window, her arms crossed tightly. "James, this doesn't make sense. We had physical evidence, photographs, fingerprints, even the witness statements. They were all here last night," she said, her voice laced with urgency. "How does an entire case file vanish without a trace?" James exhaled sharply. "Someone doesn't want us to find out what really happened to the Holloways." He turned toward the whiteboard where the Holloway case details had been painstakingly outlined: David and Margaret Holloway, missing since August 14th. Their son, Oliver, found unconscious in their ransacked home. No signs of forced entry. No ransom note. No leads. But now, there wasn't just a lack of leads, there was no case. No evidence. No trail to follow. Laura stopped pacing, her brow furrowing. "We need to check on Oliver," she said. "If someone's covering this up, he could be in danger too." James nodded, already grabbing his coat. "Let's go." Minutes later, they pulled up in front of the Holloway residence, an eerie silence hanging over the darkened house. The front door stood ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze. Alarm bells went off in James's mind as he reached for his gun. "Stay close," he murmured to Laura before pushing the door open. Inside, the house was cold, lifeless. The air smelled of stale coffee and something else, something metallic. Blood. Laura's breath hitched as they stepped into the living room. The couch was overturned, papers scattered across the floor, and in the center of it all, Oliver's phone, its screen cracked, buzzing weakly with an unread message. "You should have stayed quiet." James felt a chill creep up his spine. Whoever had erased the evidence wasn't done. And if Oliver was missing now, they were already one step too late. Detective James Carter tightened his grip on the crumpled note found in Oliver Holloway's ransacked home. "You should have stayed quiet." The message gnawed at his gut, a warning or a threat. Oliver was missing, the evidence had been erased, and now, as James scanned the scene, a new question formed in his mind: who had reason to silence him? Laura Bennett moved cautiously through the house, her trained eyes sweeping for any overlooked details. "James," she called, her voice sharp. "The alarm system, it wasn't triggered. Whoever did this had access." James turned to her, his mind working fast. Inside job? Or someone Oliver trusted? A tense silence settled between them as they considered the implications. Just then, James's phone vibrated. An anonymous tip, an address scrawled in a brief message: "You're looking in the wrong place. Come alone." James showed Laura the screen. "Looks like someone wants to talk." "You're not going alone," she stated firmly. They arrived at the location, a deserted parking lot behind an old diner. The flickering neon sign cast eerie shadows as a figure stepped out of the darkness. It was Oliver's neighbor, Daniel Hayes, his hands trembling. "They're watching me," he whispered, glancing over his shoulder. "I saw something that night. Something I wasn't supposed to." James narrowed his eyes. "What did you see?" Daniel hesitated, sweat beading on his forehead. "Oliver, he wasn't taken. He left, with them." Laura stiffened. "Who's them?" Daniel opened his mouth to answer, but his eyes widened in fear. A car engine roared in the distance. Then, a single gunshot rang out. Daniel collapsed. James drew his weapon, scanning the shadows, but the attacker was already gone. Laura knelt beside Daniel, pressing her hands against the wound. "Stay with me." But Daniel's gaze had already turned vacant. James clenched his jaw. Whatever Oliver had been caught up in, it wasn't just a simple disappearance anymore. It was a conspiracy. And they had just become the next targets. James Carter paced the dimly lit motel room, turning the small brass key over in his fingers. It was old, worn at the edges, and had no markings except for the number 47 etched faintly into the metal. It had been tucked inside Daniel Hayes' coat pocket, his last possession before he was silenced. Laura Bennett sat on the bed, flipping through Oliver Holloway's files, her brow furrowed in frustration. "We're missing something," she muttered. "This key. It must unlock something important." James exhaled, rubbing his temple. And whatever it is, someone was willing to kill to keep it hidden. His mind drifted back to the past few days, the break-in at Oliver's house, the missing evidence, the cryptic message, and now, this key. It all pointed to something bigger. Laura studied him. "You've been quiet. What's on your mind?" James hesitated before answering. "Something doesn't add up. Daniel said Oliver left with them. That means he wasn't taken against his will. What if he wasn't running from something? What if he was running to something?" Laura's eyes darkened. "You think he's involved?" "I don't know. But I do know one thing: this key is our only lead." A sudden knock on the motel door made them both freeze. James exchanged a wary glance with Laura before reaching for his gun. Slowly, he inched toward the door and peered through the peephole. No one. But when he opened the door, an envelope lay on the ground. He picked it up and tore it open, revealing a single Polaroid. It was Oliver. He stood outside an old storage facility, his face shadowed in the dim light. And in his hand was the same brass key. Laura inhaled sharply. That's not a coincidence. James turned the photo over. Scrawled in red ink was a single phrase. Find locker 47 before they do. The air in the room grew heavy. James stuffed the key into his pocket, his jaw tightening. Whatever Oliver had left behind in that locker, it was enough to get people killed. And now, they were next in line. James Carter's fingers drummed anxiously on the desk as he and Laura Bennett stared at the flickering surveillance footage. The grainy black and white video showed the hospital hallway at precisely 2:13 a.m., the last known moment before Nurse Evelyn Parker vanished without a trace. There, Laura pointed at the screen. A woman in scrubs, Evelyn, walked briskly down the corridor, glancing over her shoulder. Her posture screamed unease. James leaned in. She knew she was being followed. Seconds later, a shadowy figure appeared at the end of the hall. The angle made it impossible to see their face. Evelyn quickened her pace, disappearing around a corner. The figure hesitated before following. Then, static. The footage cut out. James clenched his jaw. Whoever took her knew exactly where the cameras were. Laura rewound the video, pausing on the last clear frame of Evelyn. She's holding something. She zoomed in, but the image was too distorted. A file? A notebook? James exhaled sharply. Something important enough to make her a target. He grabbed his phone and dialed the hospital's security office. It rang twice before a gruff voice answered. This is Carter. I need access to all camera feeds from last night, especially near the back exits. A pause. Then, the system went down for maintenance. No backups. James shot Laura a look. Convenient, he muttered. Who ordered the maintenance? The line crackled. No request was logged. Laura's stomach dropped. They wiped it, she whispered. James ended the call and stood. If we can't trace Evelyn through the cameras, we find her another way. Laura's gaze drifted back to the frozen frame of the nurse's fearful expression. She left in a hurry, she murmured. What if she left something behind? James nodded. Then we start at her apartment. Neither of them said it, but the thought hung heavy between them. Evelyn had uncovered something dangerous. And now, she was gone. James Carter pushed open the door to Evelyn Parker's apartment, the scent of stale coffee and faint lavender lingering in the air. The place was eerily silent, as if time had frozen the moment she disappeared. Papers were scattered across the desk, a laptop left open but locked with a password. A half-packed suitcase sat by the bed. She had been planning to leave in a hurry. Laura Bennett scanned the room, her sharp eyes catching a small, overturned drawer near the desk. She crouched down, picking up a few papers, her breath hitching when she saw what was inside, a hospital patient report with a red stamp reading confidential. She was onto something, Laura murmured, handing the file to James. James flipped through the pages, his brows furrowing. The report mentioned a patient X, admitted under unusual circumstances. No full name, no medical history, just a few cryptic notes about experimental treatments and sudden memory loss. The last entry was signed by Dr. Wilson, but the final page was missing. She had the full report, James muttered, glancing at the empty file folder still on the desk. And now, it's gone. Laura's stomach churned. Whoever took Evelyn must have taken that last page too. But why? James exhaled sharply. Because it held the truth. A sudden noise outside made them freeze. The soft creak of footsteps in the hallway. Laura instinctively reached for her gun. James motioned for silence as he moved toward the door, peering through the peephole. A shadow flickered past. "Someone's watching us," he whispered. Laura tightened her grip on the gun. "Then we'd better find out what they don't want us to know, before it's too late." James Carter gripped the steering wheel tightly as he and Laura sped toward the secluded facility on the outskirts of town. The coordinates they had uncovered from Evelyn Parker's stolen file led them to a heavily guarded private clinic, hidden behind dense trees and high-security fences. The revelation had stunned them. His parents, who had been declared dead years ago, were alive. The thought sent a wave of emotions crashing over James. Hope? Disbelief. Anger. Had they been held captive all this time? Why had no one told him the truth? He cast a glance at Laura, who was already formulating a plan. "We can't just walk in through the front," she murmured, scanning the perimeter through binoculars. "Too many guards." James exhaled sharply. "Then we find another way." Under the cover of darkness, they maneuvered through the wooded area, slipping past surveillance cameras until they reached a side entrance. Laura picked the lock in seconds, and they crept inside, moving down the dimly lit hallway. A faint voice drifted through the corridor. James stopped. Familiar. Distant. His heart pounded as he followed the sound, leading them to a locked door labeled Restricted Ward. He didn't hesitate. Using the key they had found earlier, he turned the lock. The door clicked open. Inside, two figures sat on a hospital bed, weak, but unmistakably his parents. "Mom? Dad?" James breathed, his voice breaking. His mother, pale and frail, lifted her head. Tears welled in her eyes as recognition dawned. "James?" Laura kept watch at the door while James rushed forward, kneeling beside them. "I thought you were dead," he choked out. His father, struggling to sit up, rasped, "They wanted you to believe that." Laura's voice was urgent. "We don't have much time. We need to move." James helped his parents to their feet, but before they could step out, an alarm blared through the building. "They know we're here," Laura said, drawing her weapon. James clenched his jaw. They had come too far to fail now. No matter what it took, he was getting his parents out. James's mind raced as he and Laura guided his frail parents through the darkened hallways of the facility. The blaring alarms echoed off the sterile walls, but they kept moving, ducking into shadows whenever guards rushed past. They needed to escape, but they also needed answers. His mother, weak but determined, clutched his arm. "James, the nursery. You need to find it." "The nursery?" he asked, confused. "It's where they kept the records." "The truth," she whispered hoarsely. James exchanged a glance with Laura. There was no time for questions. If his mother said the nursery was important, they had to find it. Navigating through the maze-like corridors, they finally came across a door with peeling paint, labeled Pediatric Ward. James pushed it open, revealing a room that looked eerily abandoned, rows of empty cribs, dust-covered rocking chairs, and faded murals of cartoon animals on the walls. But something felt off. Why would a facility like this even have a nursery? Laura searched the cabinets while James's mother pointed toward a crib at the far end. Underneath, the panel. James rushed over and felt along the wooden base. His fingers brushed against something loose. With a sharp tug, he pried open a hidden compartment, and there it was. A USB drive, tucked away in a small velvet pouch. James's pulse quickened as he turned it over in his hand. This was it. The missing piece. The proof. But before he could say anything, the door burst open. Armed guards stormed in, weapons raised. "Drop it," one of them barked. Laura moved in front of James's parents, gun steady in her grip. James clutched the USB tightly, his mind racing. They couldn't afford to lose this. And they couldn't afford to get caught. The cold, sterile room felt suffocating as James stood face to face with Robert, his former mentor, the man who had once been like a father to him. Robert's usually calm demeanor was now replaced with a nervous tension, his fingers twitching in his lap. The evidence James had found, the USB drive, the footage, the missing files, was undeniable. He had to confront him. "You knew, didn't you?" James's voice was low, almost a growl. "You were part of this. You let them take my parents." Robert shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his gaze dropping to the floor. He didn't deny it. His silence was enough of an answer. James stepped forward, the anger bubbling to the surface. "Why? Why did you do this to us? Why didn't you stop it?" Robert's voice trembled as he finally spoke. "I couldn't. I was trapped, James. They had my family. They threatened to." He stopped himself, unable to finish the sentence. James's heart raced. He had never seen this side of Robert, this broken man who had always been so controlled, so calculated. "I trusted you," James whispered. The weight of the betrayal hit him hard, suffocating. He had looked up to Robert, learned from him, respected him. And now, the man who had once been a guide, a protector, had been complicit in the horrors that had stolen his life. Robert raised his eyes, filled with regret and guilt. "I'm sorry. I didn't have a choice. I thought I could protect you, but I was wrong. I thought I could stop it." James's fists clenched at his sides, the pain in his chest threatening to spill over. "You could have helped us. You could have fought back." "But I didn't," Robert admitted quietly, his voice breaking. "I couldn't, not when they had everything." The room was heavy with the truth, the silence suffocating as James processed the confession. Robert wasn't just guilty of turning a blind eye, he was complicit in the destruction of everything James had known, everything he had loved. "Get out," James finally managed, his voice hard and cold. "I never want to see you again." Robert didn't argue, only stood up slowly and walked out of the room, his shoulders slumped in defeat. James didn't feel any relief, though. The guilt, the weight of the betrayal, still clung to him, heavier than ever. It wasn't over. Not yet. James stood at the edge of the darkened alley, his heart pounding in his chest. Everything had led him to this moment, the evidence, the revelations, the betrayals. But this final trap, the one he had carefully set, was the culmination of months of pain and confusion. Tonight, he would confront the masterminds behind everything, the people who had orchestrated the disappearance of his parents, the ones who had manipulated Robert, the ones who thought they could control his fate. He checked his watch. The time was close. He had to be ready. He glanced around, making sure there was no one in sight. The alley was empty, save for the occasional flicker of a distant streetlight. James had made sure of that. This place, isolated and secluded, was perfect for what was about to happen. There would be no interruptions. No escape. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, growing closer with each passing second. His pulse quickened. He reached into his jacket, his fingers brushing against the cold metal of the gun tucked inside. But he didn't want to use it, not yet. He had other plans. Then, a shadow appeared at the end of the alley, and James stiffened. The figures emerged from the darkness, two men, dressed in black, their faces hidden behind masks. They moved with calculated precision, the kind of confidence only those who had been trained in secrecy could possess. James recognized them instantly. They were the ones who had been pulling the strings all along. "You knew we'd come," one of them said, his voice muffled by the mask. "You've been playing a dangerous game, James." James didn't flinch. His gaze was steady, locked on the two men. "I'm done playing. This ends tonight." The second man laughed darkly. "You think you can stop us? You're just one man. Do you really think you have the power to bring this down?" For a moment, James considered their words. The odds were stacked against him. But he wasn't alone in this anymore. He had the truth. He had the evidence. And he had the one thing they could never take from him, his will to fight. "I don't need power," James said, his voice calm but firm. "I just need you to think you're winning." He saw their expressions falter, just for a split second, but it was enough. In that brief moment of doubt, he activated the device in his pocket. The sound of police sirens suddenly pierced the silence, growing louder, closer. The men froze, their eyes darting around, searching for an escape that wasn't there. The trap had been set perfectly. "You've been monitored from the moment you stepped into the alley," James said coldly, his voice now filled with triumph. "It's over." The sirens grew louder, and moments later, several police vehicles screeched to a halt at the entrance of the alley. Officers poured out, surrounding the two men. Their surprise quickly turned to panic as they realized they had been outsmarted. As the officers moved in to arrest them, James allowed himself a brief moment to breathe. He had won. The final trap had worked, and the people responsible for everything were finally going to pay. But even as the men were taken away, James knew this victory wasn't complete. It wasn't the end of the story, not yet. There were still questions left unanswered, still shadows lurking in the corners of the mystery. But for now, he had reclaimed his life. The hunt for the truth was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he might just be in control of his own fate again.